first 10 minutes or so that it's on, it's really kind of unstable. Not bad. So it's a strictly monophonic instrument, so I can't play harmonies, and I don't have perfect pitch, so it's very easy to drift. So I usually play with some kind of accompaniment just to keep myself on. Of course, it'll be even more obvious that I haven't been practicing lately, because it's like so many other instruments. It's all about training muscle memory, training your fingers to just go to the right place without having to look. Right now, they don't go to the right place immediately. They go somewhere in the neighborhood of the right place, and I have to correct it. So I'll pick something slow. Let's see, this isn't too terribly long, is it? most players are amateurs, and most of them are just using it to play soprano arias like I just did, or to play violin pieces. Some people do write for it, but there are very, very few people writing for it because you really need to. It's one of these instruments you really need to know how to play to write for it well, and it's very limited in what it can do. It was invented originally in the 1920s, and when it was first introduced to the world, audiences went crazy just over the technology. Like, the player isn't touching it. What? But almost immediately, musically savvy listeners noticed, like, wait a minute, everything's slow, and it can't play rapid articulations. So almost immediately, it became obsolete for most musicians composers who were interested in incorporating electronic sounds with traditional instruments. There's been a renaissance in the 1990s, since the 1990s, partly because by the turn of the century, you had tremendous computing power in laptops, and you could have all these great real-time manipulations of sound, but it's really boring to watch. And this is really fascinating to watch, and it's also an incredibly sensitive interface. So part of why I'm playing it so badly is because I'm out of practice. Like, it really takes these carefully controlled small motions, and it's not only that my motions aren't quite carefully controlled enough, but I'm getting a little sloppy with my stance and my breathing. This responds to your every move, whether you want to or not. So it is very tricky to write, to write for it and to use it in interesting ways.
Okay.
So it's actually a science experiment gone wrong. It was an attempt to create a device that would measure the electrical capacitance of gases, like air. And they were using a tone indicator. And it was something which should have worked very well in theory, except as they were conducting experiments, one of the experimenters noticed that the proximity of his body was affecting the readings, and so they weren't getting neutral readings. But he had some training as a cellist, so he figured out that it could be adapted as an instrument. So the circuitry is all in here, and then there are these two pieces of metal sticking out, and each one is generating an electromagnetic field. So each one senses how close the player's hand is to it, or actually any conductive object. So, it doesn't have to be the hand. It could be the elbow. It could be the feet, the hip. It could be your cell phone or anything that could hold an electric charge that gets near it in response to that. So this one controls the volume, and that's why it would sort of look like I was conducting an imaginary orchestra. So, and that's partly just to separate the notes. If I just played the melody without doing this, it would sound like it would just be sliding all over the place. And then that's the pitch controller, and so it's all about how much mass of my hand or fingers are close or far away. So treble is close and farther away down into the bass. Well, I was under the influence of mind-altering drugs. I had surgery, and so I was taking perfectly legal prescription drugs, but they did sort of impair my judgment. And somehow, at the time I was teaching across the river at MIT, and it was a freshman seminar, and I cannot even remember what the conversation was, where it came up. There got into a conversation of electronic music, and somebody mentioned the theremin, and at that time I had only ever once encountered one, in person, in a music store, and I didn't understand how it worked, and I couldn't make any sense of it. I couldn't do anything musical with it. And I had read about it, and I had some idea that took a lot of training and practice to learn these very small finger motions to play it in a controlled way. And of course, without that kind of control, you can do all sorts of fun sound effects. So, and it came up as a topic of conversation. And I said something. I just made an offhand remark to my students about how it's like, well, it's a nifty instrument, but I tried one out, and now I know I'm too old to learn how to play it. And one of my students said, "Really? Do you really think you are?" And I thought about it. It's like, yeah, I'm too old, but on the other hand, it would be so much fun to have one just to make the silly noises with it. So I decided to get one. Ones like this actually aren't that expensive. Especially compared to like getting a good electric guitar, it's actually, it's competitive. So I bought one just for fun, and then it turned out it came with an instructional video that explained the basics of the technique. So I started learning, and it's a fantastic time now to start learning to play theremin, because there are now a couple of method books out on the market where people have, with detailed photographs showing here's what you need to do. There are instructional videos up on YouTube, and you can just see, you have so many more opportunities now to just see people playing it and get a sense of what's involved, and because it's really not, there's no one official, historically developed way to play it. So part of figuring out what you're going to do is watching people and finding the people whose style you like. Like, yeah, I want to play that way, and then study what they do to observe it. And if you're really lucky, then you get to meet them and actually ask them in person. So I started playing in 2005, and this past summer I finally got the opportunity to work with someone who's a world-class player, and she helped point out a lot of things that I needed to work on. So now I'm particularly aware of how limited my skills are, but there's hope. There's still time. I don't remember when I started exactly, because it would be like writing pop songs as a teenager. Yeah. But I decided to become serious about it when I was 17, and I spent a summer at a kind of arts camp, summer program for high schoolers who were talented in the arts. And I was actually there in creative writing. It has to be a long story. I thought I was going to be a visual artist. I thought I was going to be some kind of graphic designer or something. But I've been active with music and theater and so on, and I was at this summer program as a writer because that was the easiest way to get in. and I had a friend who was there as a composer, and there was one summer, toward the end of the summer, there was a day I was inviting him to join some of us for a volleyball game. He's like, "Oh, I can't. I have to make my electronic music project." Ooh, electronic music! What's in the studio? What are you using? And he saw that I was really interested. So I said, "Hey, you want to come along and watch?" It's like, okay, cool, yes. And then while I was watching him slap together his final project, I just kept thinking, "Oh wait, no, it could be so much more interesting if you did that, and if you changed that like this." And I realized, even though I didn't know how to use the equipment, I had these very clear ideas about how to make the music better. So that's when I thought, I think this is what I really want to do. That's tricky. I would. It's usually for classically trained players, and it's usually for acoustic instruments rather than electronics. Or if there are electronics, it's just one additional, like electric guitar or theremin or something. It tends to be atonal rather than tonal, and I like to play with polyrhythm and polymeter and having a sense of different streams of pulses that are going on at the same time, and some kind of fading in and out or pursuing independent agendas. And it's usually there are some people who write music where there are very complicated parts that are presented in a very straightforward way, and I tend to do the opposite. of creating very, very simple motives and very simple elements, and then piling them up, combining them in complex ways. So I think that's the best answer I can give for like what kind of music I write.
Okay.
I do. I do tend to start with a harmony, and it's. I have a notebook in my coat that I carry around with me. So like, there's a piece I'm in the early stages of right now, and there are some things where I'm taking melodic licks and playing with how to distort them. But yeah, often it's about saying, okay, how can I achieve a sense of inevitability? Because the thing for me, even though the music I write isn't tonal, part of what I love about tonal music is the way that a composer like Bach or Beethoven or Schumann can create a sense of motion, and then there's a partial resolution, but we're not really done yet, and there's more that needs to happen. And how do you create that sense of ongoing ebb and flow, but that keeps going right through to the end? So of an important first stage for me to figuring out what's going on in the piece is figuring out, okay, what is that goal? Where is it going to end up? And then how is it going to get there? How is it going to start? And then that determines what kinds of harmonies are going to happen. Because if it's the same harmony for 11 or 12 minutes, that gets boring. So it'll usually figure out a way to mix it up so that some portions will be very dissonant cluster, atonal cluster harmonies. But then other things will have a much more open, maybe jazzy, or even in some places more traditional. Like maybe they're traditional chords, but they just don't follow each other in a traditional way. Yes, a lot. None well.
Okay.
And that's part. I think that's part of how I wound up as a composer. Is that I was just kind of drifting. Because when I was young, it started on clarinet, and then had some piano lessons, but lost interest, and then switched from clarinet to saxophones, and then started learning guitar. And then by the time I got to college, I figured out, I think I want to be a composer, and then I felt that I needed to have some sense of how every instrument works in order to write for them well. So that only added fuel to the fire. So I've never really sat down and pursued one instrument for 10 years in a row to get really good at it. It's always been kind of bouncing around. And so like the theremin, I don't think I'll ever be a world-class soloist, but it's made me a more expressive guitarist because you have such limited articulation, and you have so little control over the timbre. It's all about timing, and especially vibrato. So now I listen to vibrato, and I think about vibrato much more carefully when I'm playing guitar. And it's ruined me for keyboard synthesizers, because I used to have a nice little analog synthesizer that I would use for gigging, and it would drive me crazy then because I'd be playing, and you're playing a lick with your right hand, and then with your left hand you have these two modulation wheels, and one that you can use to control the depth of the vibrato, and one for the speed of the vibrato, one for the amount, one for the depth, but then you need a third one for the speed, or vice versa, right? Like there are these at least 3 dimensions to it that you want to be able to control independently, and it's just they're not there on most instruments, or even if they are, that's really a horrendously difficult thing to control in a meaningful way. Whereas with your hand, it's just all about how much you're moving back and forth, or circular motion, and again, the fact is it's just instantly responsive. Oh, absolutely, yes. There are traditionally a lot of composers start off as pianists, and that's really good training in terms of being able to see, to have all the music in front of you. Because if you're playing in a band or an orchestra, you've just got one component. If you're singing in a choir, you do have the rest of it in front of you, but piano music, they typically get to do more complex things even than choirs do. And the catch is some of them, the ones who are really, really good, sometimes have trouble imagining things in other than pianistic terms. So they end up writing piano music and then trying to transcribe it or arrange it for other instruments. And then sometimes they learn the hard way that if they start with an idea that sounds really cool on the piano, and then they discover, oh, but when you translate that into like a brass quintet, it's really muddy in that register. It doesn't have the same clarity. They don't have the same rhythmic attacks or something. So I feel like that definitely helps when, like in the notebook, I may be playing with something abstract, but then when I'm saying like, okay, let's see, this will sound really good. If that's a flute and then the clarinet and bassoon, no, that's too low for the bassoon. It does help.
Right.
I do. I do often exploit the playback feature in the notation software just to get a sense of how things are going. You always have to filter that because it's not a perfect rendition. And so another part of the training is getting a sense of recognizing when the computer playback sounds bad, but the real thing will sound good. It's like, okay, in the hands of a real oboist, that note will sound beautiful. This thing coming out of the computer just and the reverse. Sometimes when it's okay, the computer is playing this perfectly in a way that human beings never will, and does that matter? Right. And so sometimes it's something you say, oh, that's okay because I want it to be a little blurry anyway. I don't want it to be that clean. But sometimes you do something that's like, yes, this sounds great, and you realize no, humans can't do that. And then for some of those large-scale polyrhythm effects I was talking about, those I often wind up using a spreadsheet to calculate. Like there might be a chromatic line that's just kind of a chromatic scale going up, but instead of going up at a steady rate, it starts off slowly and then gradually accelerates. And so if you're doing that for a very short time, you can just take a piece of graph paper and sketch a logarithmic curve by hand, and then just calculate, and then just interpret that, figure, okay, this is when things happen. But to do something that's going to take place over 7 minutes or something, then to get it right, you really have to use a spreadsheet. And it's a really awkward way to work. But the results are so cool that it's like, okay, it's worth it. So that's actually probably the most interesting way that I use computer to help me write. I keep trying to work more quickly. There will be a kind of gestation period of several months while I'm playing with ideas and trying some things out. But then once I know what I'm doing, then I can bash it out fairly quickly. And again, this is another important thing for me because as I've taught students in composition classes, if you have just with improvisation, if you have good players, if you give them like a jazz standard, if you give them a structure and say, here's the overall structure, just work out the details yourself on the fly. They can do that beautifully. That's no problem. The hard part is if you say, like, okay, here are some details. Now improvise a really interesting structure and coherent structure out of this. That's hard to do. So for me, that's the more important task as a composer, is figuring out, okay, what's the overall shape? What's going to make this hold together so it actually is interesting to listen to for 12 or 13 or 17 minutes, and people aren't just going to zone out. I still take a little longer than I'd like to figure those things out. But then once I do, then filling in the details is, in a way, once you have that large structure in place, the individual details aren't so very important, right? Or there are lots of plausible solutions. Oh gosh, I should have brought notes to illustrate this. Try it here. Well, okay, so here's a metaphorical explanation. You could have, say geometrically, right? Like pretend not bad. Pretend that's a perfect circle, right? So that's obviously a perfect circle, but you could also do something which is not continuous, and people will still recognize it as a circle. Or you could even have something that's right? Or you think about it like you know, Christmas wreath. It is a good example of that, where like everything's actually pointing in a different direction, but the overall shape is clear. So with something like that, then it could be something. I have one friend who did something almost insanely simple, where he had a piece where from harmony to harmony there was just a kind of chromatic scale going through them. Although it wasn't even necessarily in the same octave of the green pen style. So it'd be the kind of thing where he might have a C, and then the next chord would have a C sharp in it somewhere, and the next one might have a D. So even if they were in different registers, subliminally, like it took me a while to catch on. I didn't notice it immediately in the piece. It was only about halfway through. Like, wait a minute. And then what I'll often do is, it might be something like, have all the harmonies be controlled by having 4 lines. So let's say, for example, this is let's say this is pardon, I'll just translate that into notation. So here's like a low, widely spaced chord. So that might be the beginning of the piece, and then at the end of the piece, I might have some very high cluster. In fact, let's pretend it's the top. The 4 notes at the very top of the piano keyboard. So that would be like a C and a B flat and a B natural and an A. So what? C, oh, sorry, 2 octaves higher. Quindicesima. So C8, E8, B flat, A. Sorry, there should be 7s, shouldn't I? So then, the harmony. If let's say we're going to do something really simple and just make these proceed in straight lines. And the fun thing with something like that is, well, okay, so I've drawn these as diagonals, and of course each one would be a kind of stepped, and so on. And now here's where I really wish I'd prepared a presentation. Because, for example, right, each one of these is a different distance. Let's see, C2 to C7 would be 5 octaves, which would be 60 plus 9. So that would be 69 semitones. F2 to B, let's see, F2 to F7 would be 60, and that would be 65 semitones. B2 to B, oh, there we go, that's a nice even 60. And E3 to E7 would be 48, and 9 would be 57. Right, right? So if each one is moving at a steady rate, then they're changing at different times. Because this would be 1/69 to the whole duration, whereas this would happen at 1/65, and so on. So you get like suspensions where each voice is moving at a different time. So on the one hand, each voice could have a completely predictable path. Like you would catch on if you know, let's say this were if this were a string quartet. Well, okay, a violin can't play that note, but if this were a string quartet of if it were an orchestra, and we start off with the violas and the cellos and the double basses here, and let's say it started off in a way that you could tell, like, oh, okay, there's a top line and it's just moving up a chromatic scale. The progress of each line is predictable, but when you have 4 of these going on at the same time, it becomes a little harder to keep track of, wait, who moves next, when? And you'll note that, let's hope this works. Okay, in terms of the intervals, this has a perfect fourth. Oh, there's no tip in it. Okay, we're in monochrome. Right, so there's 5, 6, right, a perfect fifth, or a perfect fourth of 5 semitones, and then a tritone of 6 semitones, and then a perfect fourth of 5. But they're going to gradually reach this cluster where it's 1, 1, and 1. Right, so maybe, so somewhere around halfway through, you might have something where there's a 2, a 3, and a 2, right, which might look something like this. And of course, the theremin can't demonstrate this, but this sounds like a tonal chord. It's just a minor 7th chord, or C minor 7 there. And then, meanwhile, back here, right, there might be some place where there's a 3, 4, and 3, which, right, let's say that's probably somewhere still in the bass register. Oh, hey, what do you know? Another minor, there is an E minor 7th chord, it's just, right, a different voicing. So the fun thing about this kind of structure, you start off with what are called quartal harmonies, harmonies that are built from fourths instead of thirds. And then as it goes along, it goes through a stage where it'll mix thirds and fourths, and then here, this would be, it's all thirds, right? Minor thirds, 3 semitones, major thirds, 4 semitones. And then it'll start adding in seconds, and then you'll have seconds and thirds, and then eventually it becomes all seconds, and then all minor seconds. And it'll do this in a way you can't draw a crisp line to figure out when it moves from one to the other. Oh, okay. Now that's just that would just give you 4-note chords. But if it's always 4-note chords, that's going to kind of gray out. So what you can do with something like this, and here's where it goes back to Lizzie's question about, with this kind of general structure in place, you can start to play with erasing bits of one line or another, right? It doesn't have to be every step of the chromatic scale. You could leave out some notes, or for some places where you want to have a thicker harmony, you could take the basic 4-note chord that comes from this structure and then add notes above and below. So I could throw in an E natural and a C sharp, and above it I could add an F sharp and an A, and that would be adding another 3 and another 3 and another 3 and another 3 and so on. So here I'm being consistent with the intervals so that it maintains a characteristic sound. But then I can add or subtract tones very freely. Or I can say, if there's a long stretch, right, like if I'm using one of these logarithmic curves, and there's a long stretch of these 4-note chords, we don't really want to hear this 4-note chord the whole time, then you can set up something where you start off with the 4-note chord, and then one voice moves down to another note, and then it goes back, and then another voice moves. And so on. Or you can even have completely different chords that it goes to, from, and away. So again, in a way, just like tonal music. Yeah, and so part of why it takes me so long, part of why there's a long gestation period, is because I hate to repeat myself. I hate to just take a structure that I used for one piece and then recycle it for another piece. I'm always looking like, well, wait, what if I do this? What if I make this last longer? How long can I draw out this process before it breaks? Kind of test to destruction. And part of what I'm playing with now is this idea of like, yeah, what if, and here's where I would want to have other colors that actually work. Like, what if you have, and usually when I've had a continuous line like that, there's a fair amount of continuity on the musical surface. Like, what if there isn't? What if it sounds like somebody's surfing channels? What if you just keep getting these? It just sounds like it's different styles of music, bam, 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 right after each other, which on the one hand would be a very chaotic musical surface, but what if you have a line like that, or several lines like that, running through the whole thing, so that, you know, even though it may sound like it's going from something very quiet and still and peaceful to something very aggressive and metal, but what if it's actually the same harmony, or almost the same harmony? How well will those connections come through? Will it be enough to make it sound coherent, or will it just be really annoying? That's what I'm wrestling with right now.
All right, cool.
The other thing I'll mention, which another cool thing about learning to play theremin now is it's like any other instrument. There's a lot of value in just playing scales and arpeggios, because that's what you encounter in actual music. But then I've found it can also be really useful to take a track and just do what's called time stretching with it. So, for example, there's a very fast aria from a Baroque opera that goes like this. And that's just much too fast. Now, I can't do that. Whoops. I can't do that yet. But I have it at different speeds. So, for example, here's a really slow version of it, which I probably could do, even though I'm woefully out of practice. Oh, I see. No, pardon me. There's a short introduction, and then let me try this again. I'm still forgetting how to do this. Does it start right away? Pardon. Terrible demonstration. I'm going to edit this out, right? But the idea being that you know, you can for an actual individual selection. I'm really just completely forgetting it. Huh. Okay, here's another one. This is a very popular item for thereminists. It's a piece by Rachmaninoff. And, you know, at full speed, it goes like this. So, and that's just the beginning. So you know, I obviously kind of know it, but the intonation's really sloppy. You know, it's everything. I keep hitting notes a little flat, a little sharp. So here's a version of it slowed down by a factor of about 2.6. Right, so. Right, so it still takes me about the same amount of time to adjust each note to get it right, but now the hand gets to sit on that note longer to get a sense like, oh, okay, that's what the E natural feels like. Oh, that's what the B natural feels like. And so then, by starting with the slowed down version, and there's a beauty of digital technology. Now it's really easy. There's a piece of freeware that was released a couple of years ago. It's really easy now to take a practice track and create versions of it at different speeds, so you can really work with it and get to know exactly what that piece ought to feel like in slow motion, and really nail every note, and then just gradually